Welcome to Cultured, the podcast about everything fermenting with your host, Nathalie Marin. Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Cultured, the podcast all about fermenting. This is where we're going to dive deep into the bubbly, tangy, effervescent world of fermented foods and drinks. I am your host, Nathalie Marin, fermentation teacher, kombucha brewer, ginger bug enthusiast, and lover of all things alive with beneficial bacteria. Whether you're brand new to fermenting or a seasoned jar juggler, this podcast is for you. Today we are kicking off things with a foundational episode, Fermentation 101. What is it and why should you care? We'll talk about what fermentation actually is, why it's been used by humans for thousands of years, and how it benefits your health, and why it might just become your very next obsession. Grab a cup of kombucha, settle in, and let's get started. What is fermentation? Let's begin with the basics. Fermentation is a natural process where microorganisms like bacteria, yeast, or mold break down sugars and starches into simpler substances like alcohol, acids, and gases. These byproducts help to preserve food, change its flavor and texture, and often make it more digestible and nutritious. There are different types of fermentation, so let's go over the basic ones of what we're going to be doing at home. The first one is lactic acid fermentation, and this is what you're going to be primarily doing with your food. So this is the one behind your favorite sour foods like sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, and even yogurt. It involves lactic acid bacteria converting sugars into lactic acid, which preserves the food and gives it that tangy flavor, and you usually do this using salt or a salt brine. Number two, the one that so many of us absolutely love, and that is alcohol fermentation. Using yeast to convert sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide for those bubbles to make it fizzy and delicious. This is how we get wine, beer, and bread. And then acetic acid fermentation. This is how we get our vinegars and our kombuchas and a lot of our wild sodas. So it's a very similar process to alcohol fermentation, but it's just with one or two tweaks where you'd rather, instead of getting alcohol at the end of the day, you're going to get acetic acid. So fermentation isn't just one thing, it's a whole spectrum of microbiome magic. Part 2, a short fermentation history. Humans have been fermenting for over 9,000 years. Ancient Chinese texts talk about fermenting soy products such as soy sauce, that we all know and love. Egyptians brewed beer, and side note there, a lot of the workers or slaves kept by the Egyptians were paid in beer. In Africa, people fermented millet into porridge. We also have a lot of traditional African beers as well that are fermented. And in Europe, we're talking about sauerkrauts and sourdoughs, and that's where those wonderful recipes originated from. Why did people ferment things? The primary reason is preservation. So before refrigeration, fermentation was essential for food preservation. It wasn't just practical, it was also flavorful and healing. So fermented foods were often seen as sacred or medicinal, and in many cultures they were even part of daily rituals. And fast forward to today, we are discovering what our ancestors knew all along. Fermented foods are good for us, and even modern day science is starting to prove that that is true. Health benefits of fermented foods. Why should we care about fermentation now? What's in it for your body? We no longer need to ferment food for preservation. We have many modern appliances like the refrigerator that help us so that we don't have to do that. Here are a few of the big health benefits for you and your body. Number one is gut health. Fermented foods are rich in probiotics, which are beneficial bacteria that support your digestive system. They help balance your gut microbiome, improve digestion, and can reduce issues like bloating, gas, and constipation, which quite often happens with modern unhealthy diets. Immune system support. About 70% of your immune system is in your gut. A healthy microbiome helps regulate your immune responses, making you more resilient to illness. And eating and drinking fermented foods regularly helps to improve that microbiome in your gut. Nutrient boost. Fermentation can increase the bioavailability of vitamins like vitamin B12, K2, and various B complex vitamins. It also helps break down anti-nutrients that might interfere with nutrition absorption. So fermenting your foods actually helps your body to be able to absorb those foods much more easily. Mental health. This is a big one for a lot of people out there. Your gut and brain are actually connected, and a lot of us don't realize this. And they're connected via the gut-brain axis. Fermented foods can support mood, reduce anxiety, and even play a role in managing depression. Something a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of your serotonin production happens in your gut, and serotonin is our natural happiness drug. So just by having a really good healthy microbiome, you can improve your body's serotonin, and it can help to make you feel happier. It literally helps to improve your mood. Flavor and variety would be the last reason we would want to try fermenting, because there are some flavors in fermented foods that you just cannot get otherwise. So on this very simple note, fermented foods are delicious, and it's up to you to discover which ones you love. They add complexity, umami, and a punch of personality to your plate. For those of you who don't know, umami is best described as this. So umami is that flavor that you get from eating foods like Marmite, that slightly acidic, tangy. It's very difficult to explain exactly the flavor, which is where umami comes in. And it's one of the human body's few ways of being able to taste protein and certain healthy nutrients. So when something tastes umami, it's because we are tasting literally the goodness in the food. So think of how something like Marmite tastes or miso tastes, that tangy, slightly acidic, soury flavor that is really good for us. That's umami. So let's get to the part we have all been waiting for. How to start your fermentation journey. Now that you know what fermentation is and why it matters, how do you get started? Start small. Pick one ferment to try, and something that's simple, that's virtually foolproof. I personally recommend sauerkraut because it is incredibly easy. It's virtually foolproof and just needs 2 ingredients, cabbage and salt. I will share the link in the description below for my basic recipe for you to go and give a try. But when you are picking that very first fermentation, pick something that you will enjoy. So if you do not enjoy cabbage, don't do sauerkraut. If you don't enjoy gherkins, don't do the pickles, fermented pickles. If you don't enjoy black tea, don't do kombucha. Do something that you enjoy eating. And then ask yourself, what kind of fermentation are you most interested in? Are you interested in doing lacto ferments with salt brines, which is usually your foods? Are you interested in doing sugar ferments, which would normally be your wild sodas or your kombuchas or your drinks? Or are you looking to try an alcohol fermentation? Believe it or not, but that's where I started. The very first thing I fermented, now about 15 years ago, was an orange tea wine. And that was my very first introduction into fermentation and the first thing I started. And from there, I did do a lot more alcohol fermenting. That was my first introduction into fermenting and how I really got hooked. And then from there, I went on to doing sourdough, and from there, uh, sauerkraut and the kimchi, and then the lacto ferments. Now I do quite an array of fermentation, but for me, it all started with alcohol. But for you, decide what piques your interest right now and try to find a really simple recipe to help you to get started. The simpler the better. So perhaps Google foolproof lacto ferment, foolproof alcohol ferment, or foolproof acetic acid ferment. So those are your three primary ones. And vinegars are incredibly easy to start with. So if you don't want to do a salt ferment like a cabbage, maybe you want to do a vinegar for yourself, like a fruit scrap vinegar. That is also a very easy fermentation to start. So that's it. So once you know where you want to start, I highly recommend grab yourself a journal that you can record your processes in, because I know the frustration is nothing worse than getting started on your fermentation journey and you create something absolutely amazing, but then you can't remember how you went about doing it. We'll have a fermentation journal, record your steps, record your processes. It'll also really help you to understand where you went wrong and how you can improve any fermentations going forward. And that is how I recommend you start your fermentation journey. You can also continue to follow this podcast or go check out my blog. I have a few really great beginner recipes on my blog. I will leave that link again in the description below. What's coming up in Cultured? In future episodes, we'll be diving into specific ferments, from kombucha to kimchi to kefir. I'm going to be answering any questions that you might be throwing at me, anything you might want to know with regards to fermenting. So if you do come across my podcast, leave some questions for me and I will do my best to cover those questions in an upcoming episode. We'll have interviews with fellow fermenters, explore seasonal recipes, and even discuss how fermentation ties into sustainability, food waste, and mindful living. I specifically focus on living a zero waste lifestyle, which is also why I do a lot of fermenting. There's so many things you can do in fermentation that helps you to lower, if not remove, the waste from your kitchen. If you are as excited about fermenting as I am, I'm absolutely passionate about it. Hit that follow or subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. And remember to hit the bell notification so that you do get a notification every time a new episode goes live. And if you enjoyed today's show, please leave a review or a comment below. It helps this podcast grow and reach more fermentation curious folks like you. There's a few closing thoughts for you today. Fermentation is more than a food trend. In fact, it's been around for thousands of years, so I would say it's a lot more than a food trend. It's an ancient practice that invites you to slow down, connect with nature, and nourish your body from the inside out. So go ahead, crack open that kraut, sip your kombucha, or start your first batch. Welcome to the Fermenting Life. Thanks for listening to this episode of Cultured Podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation and want to help keep the jars bubbling and the podcast going, you can support the show in a couple of lovely ways. Visit my online shop for fermentation tools, digital guides, and handmade goodies, perfect for your own cultured kitchen. Or if you just want to say thanks and keep me caffeinated during late night fermenting sessions, you can always buy me a cup of coffee. The link's in the show notes below. Your support means the world and it helps this little fermentation corner of the internet keep growing. Until next time, stay curious, stay cultured.